It was a typical Tuesday morning when I stepped out of my car, ready for another long shift. I'm Officer Kelly Brooks, and I've been working with the K-9 unit for almost 3 years now. My partner Max is a big German shepherd with a nose for trouble. I could tell from the look in his eyes that something was off that day. He was more alert than usual, his tail twitching as we walked into the station. "All right, boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "Let's get through today, yeah?" The moment I finished my sentence, my radio crackled to life. It was a call about a disturbance near a local funeral home. Normally, these types of calls are routine, maybe someone accidentally knocks over a display or something minor like that. But the way the dispatcher said it, I could tell it was different. She sounded worried. "Officer Brooks, we've got a situation. Possible trespassing at the funeral home. The owner's concerned about something inside. Can you head over?" I didn't hesitate. On my way. I could feel Max's energy shift, and his ears perked up as he picked up on my urgency. We jumped in the patrol car and headed toward the funeral home. When we arrived, I could see the building in the distance, old, slightly run down, but there was something almost peaceful about it. The owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Lawson, was waiting by the front door. He looked anxious, his face pale, like he hadn't slept in days. "Officer Brooks, thank God you're here," he said, his voice shaky. There's something wrong inside. I don't know how to explain it." I glanced at Max, who was now whimpering softly, his nose twitching in the direction of the building. He was ready to go. "Take a deep breath, Mr. Lawson," I said gently. "Tell me what's going on." "I don't know. It sounds crazy, but my dog Benny, he's been acting strange all morning. And then I saw something. I think it's the casket. Something's off." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "All right, we'll check it out. Just stay here." Max and I headed inside. The air was heavy with the smell of flowers, and everything was eerily quiet. I followed the faint sound of Benny's barking to the back of the room where the casket was placed. Max's behavior was even more intense now. He tugged at the leash, pulling me toward the casket. There was an undeniable sense of urgency in his movements. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As we walked closer, I noticed Benny, the little terrier, pacing around the casket, barking furiously. His fur was standing on end, and his eyes were wide with panic. I knelt down next to him, trying to calm him, but he was too worked up. "Hey boy, it's okay," I whispered, my voice soft. But Benny didn't stop barking. His small body trembled with fear. Max, still tugging at the leash, wasn't much better. He was on high alert, his ears perked and his mouth slightly open. Something wasn't right, I could feel it in my bones. Mr. Lawson stood behind us, wringing his hands nervously. I don't know what's going on. I've worked here for over 15 years, and I've never seen Benny act like this before. I've never felt like this about a funeral home either." His voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes. There was something in that room that neither of us could explain. I slowly moved toward the casket, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was expecting, but when I looked down, my breath caught in my throat. Inside the casket was a man, but something was wrong. His face was pale, almost ghostly. His hands were clenched at his sides like he was holding on to something, like he was still alive, but trapped in that coffin. I glanced over at Mr. Lawson, who had gone completely white, his lips trembling. He looks like he's still breathing," he stammered. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as I stepped closer. "What's his name?" I asked, voice barely a whisper. "His name was Carl Martin. He died in a car accident last week." Mr. Lawson's voice cracked as he spoke. I glanced at Max, who was now standing still, staring at the casket. His eyes were wide, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or recognition? I gently touched the edge of the casket, my fingers trembling. I don't know why I was scared. I had seen death before. I had seen all kinds of things in this job, but this felt different. Max let out a low growl, and that was when I realized. The man in the casket wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible noise coming from the casket. It was a sound I didn't expect to hear. A gasp. I froze. The room was so silent that the faintest sound felt like it echoed. I glanced at Mr. Lawson, but his eyes were wide with confusion, unable to process what we just heard. The sound came again. A faint gasp, like someone trying to take in a breath after being submerged in water. Max's growl grew louder. His body stiffened, and I could feel the tension in his muscles. It wasn't just the dog now, it was everything. My heartbeat quickened, and I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself. Without thinking, I took a step back, pulling Max with me. My eyes never left the casket. I needed to confirm if I was hearing things, or if something unnatural was happening. "Mr. Lawson." "Call an ambulance," I said, my voice shaky but firm. There was no time for hesitation. I couldn't just stand there, not knowing what was going on. He fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed the number. The operator on the other end answered quickly, and Mr. Lawson tried to explain the situation, but his words were coming out in a jumble. I couldn't blame him. How could you explain something like this? I knelt down to Benny, who was still barking furiously. "It's okay, buddy, we'll figure this out," I whispered, trying to comfort him. But his frantic barking only intensified. He wasn't just scared, he was desperate. Max was suddenly tugging on the leash again, pulling me toward the casket. There was no mistaking it now. Max knew something we didn't. "Max, wait," I started, but it was too late. The dog was already beside the casket, his nose pressed up against the wood. Then, as if to confirm my worst fear, the lid of the casket creaked open. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat as the coffin slowly began to reveal its contents. The man inside, Carl Martin, wasn't dead. Not anymore. His eyes opened wide, as if he had been asleep, but he was now fully awake. I felt the world tilt beneath me. I didn't know what to think. How was this possible? How could he be alive? His chest was rising and falling in shallow breaths, his fingers twitched, and he groaned softly, as though he were coming out of some kind of fog. "Help me," he gasped weakly, his voice barely audible. I stood there, paralyzed. I had seen a lot in my career, but this was something I had no words for. Max was growling again, low and deep, as he circled around the casket. He knew something wasn't right, and now I couldn't deny it either. Carl's eyes slowly shifted toward me, filled with confusion, pain, and something else, something desperate. "Please, help," he whispered again, his hand reaching out weakly toward me. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at him. I kept telling myself this wasn't real, that I was dreaming, but everything felt too vivid, too real. I could see the fear in Carl's eyes, the panic that made him try to lift his arms, weakly pushing against the sides of the casket. It wasn't possible. He shouldn't have been alive. "Carl, listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're okay. You're safe now." But even as I said the words, I knew they didn't make sense. How could he be safe? How could he be alive? He groaned again, his breath shallow. "I can't breathe. Something's wrong." His words trailed off into a weak cough, and I felt my heart race. I needed to do something. I needed to help him, but I had no idea how. "Mr. Lawson," I shouted, my voice shaky now. "You need to get help now." Mr. Lawson, who had been standing frozen in place, seemed to snap back to reality. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with his phone, trying to make the call to 911 again. Max was still at my side, pacing around nervously, his eyes constantly on Carl, and I could feel the tension in the room thickening with every passing second. Carl's breath was coming faster now, and his movements were growing more erratic. He was trying to push himself up, his hands clawing weakly at the casket, but his body didn't have the strength. He looked lost, as if he couldn't fully grasp where he was, what was happening. "Help?" His voice was barely a whisper now, strained and desperate. I couldn't just stand there. I had to do something. I reached for his hand, gently trying to guide him, my fingers trembling against his cold skin. His eyes locked onto mine, pleading. "What happened to you?" I asked, more to myself than to him, though the words were heavy with the weight of a question I couldn't answer. His grip on my hand tightened, though it was weak, and I felt the fear in his touch. Then, his eyes seemed to widen in a moment of clarity, as though something had snapped into focus. He opened his mouth to say something, but his words were drowned out by a loud crash from the back of the room. It was Benny, the terrier, barking frantically. I turned quickly, just in time to see Benny darting toward the door, growling at the shadows in the hallway. Something was wrong. There was something else in that building, something I couldn't see. Before I could react, Carl's hand shot out, grabbing mine with more strength than I had expected. "It's not over," he whispered. You have to get out, before it's too late. The urgency in his voice made my heart race. I could feel the weight of his words, but my body refused to move. And then Max let a terrifying. Max's bark echoed through the room, louder and more frantic than before. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen in place, still holding Carl's hand, my heart hammering in my chest. Carl's grip tightened on me, his face twisted in a mixture of fear and desperation. You have to leave. They're coming. They won't stop until they get what they want. What do you mean? My voice felt small against the chaos building inside me. I could barely think, but something deep inside me knew that Carl was trying to tell me something important. He coughed weakly again, his chest rattling with the effort. I'm not supposed to be here. This is all wrong. They brought me back, but it's not me anymore. Not completely. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? I repeated, my voice shaking. Who brought you back? Carl's eyes flickered toward the door. And I followed his gaze. My mind raced, but the air around us felt thick, suffocating. There was something else in that building, something just out of sight. I slowly pulled my hand away from Carl's, but he grabbed it one last time, his fingers cold and clammy. You have to get out of here, he urged, his voice desperate. You have no idea what's coming. They'll come for you too. You need to get out now. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and before I could say another word, I heard a noise, a soft rustling from the hallway outside. The sound of footsteps. Max's growling intensified. His fur was standing on end as he snarled at the door, his body tense, ready to attack. I turned to Mr. Lawson, who was still on the phone, his face pale and sweating. Call for backup, I said urgently. Get help now. But the footsteps were getting closer. And then, just as I thought they would stop at the door, the knob turned. I barely had time to react. The door creaked open, and a tall figure stepped inside. The figure was dressed in all black, their face hidden beneath a dark hood. The air felt colder, like a sudden chill had filled the room. I instinctively reached for my gun, my fingers shaking, but the figure raised a hand, as though to stop me. Put it away, Officer Brooks, the figure said, their voice smooth, almost familiar. I froze. The voice. I knew that voice. It wasn't the figure itself that made my heart stop, it was the voice. And then the figure stepped into the light. It was Carl. But it wasn't Carl. I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, unable to process what I was seeing. The man who had been lying lifeless in the casket, the one who had gasped for breath moments ago, was now standing before me. But it wasn't him. The figure that looked like Carl wore the same face, the same body, but his eyes, they were different, hollow, dark, as if something inside him had died, leaving only a shell behind. You're not Carl, I whispered, though I already knew the answer. It felt like a punch to the gut, the truth sinking in like a heavy weight. The figure smiled, if you could even call it that. It was a twisted, unnatural thing. You're right, the man said, his voice colder now. Carl's gone. What you're seeing now is just a fragment of him. A copy. I took a step back, my hand instinctively moving toward my weapon. What the hell are you talking about? Who are you? I am what remains, the figure said, his voice almost serene, as though he were speaking about something as casual as the weather. I am the one who was sent to retrieve what was lost, the one who makes sure that life and death stay in their proper place. My mind raced, but nothing made sense. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but all I could do was stand there, paralyzed by a fear I had never known before. Max growled, his teeth bared as he stared at the figure. Even he knew something was wrong. The figure chuckled, low and menacing, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Your dog understands, Officer Brooks. He knows when something's not right. I turned back to Carl, or what was left of him. He was lying motionless in the casket again, his face still and lifeless, but I could see the faintest trace of a tear running down his cheek. It was as though he was pleading for help, even from beyond whatever had brought him back. What did you do to him? I demanded, my voice shaking now. The figure tilted his head. We didn't do anything to him. He wasn't meant to come back. Not like this. But some people, they make mistakes. They break the rules. His eyes turned dark and the air grew even colder. And when those mistakes happen, people like me have to fix them, before things get worse. I felt my knees buckle, my mind overwhelmed with confusion. I didn't understand any of this. All I knew was that something terrible was happening, something beyond my control. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away from this place, but something in me held me in place. It was as if I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Is Carl? Is he really gone? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure took a slow step forward, his eyes narrowing. Not completely, but you won't recognize him anymore. The part of him that was human is fading away. It won't be long before it's all gone. I felt my heart shatter, my body trembling as I realized the full horror of what was happening. Carl wasn't dead. He wasn't alive either. He was something else, something in between. And whatever had taken over him, whatever had brought him back, was now after me. Suddenly, the figure took another step closer, his presence suffocating. It's time for you to leave, Officer Brooks, before you become a part of the mistake too. I reached for my gun, my breath coming in short gasps. But before I could pull it from its holster, Max lunged at the figure, his growl turning into a full-on bark of rage. The figure raised his hand, and with a single motion, Max was thrown backward, slamming into the wall with a bone-shaking thud. I cried out, rushing to my partner's side, but I knew it was pointless. Max was knocked out cold, and the figure, whatever he was coming for me next. You should have never come here, he said softly, his voice cold and final. I turned to Carl's lifeless body, the one still lying in the casket. The man who had been Carl. The man who had been brought back from the dead. But the truth was, Carl was gone. And whatever remained in his place was something far worse. And I was the one who had to face it. I had no time to think, no time to process the horror of what was happening. The figure's dark eyes were locked onto me, and I could feel his presence closing in, suffocating me with each step he took. My hand gripped the cold steel of my gun, but my fingers were numb, trembling with fear. Max lay unconscious, sprawled out on the floor, and I couldn't bring myself to leave him. I knew I had to act, but my body was frozen in place, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was up against. This wasn't just some criminal or criminal mastermind. This wasn't even a typical bad guy. This was something far beyond that. I'm not gonna let you take me, I managed to say, though my voice sounded weak and small, barely audible. I held my gun out in front of me, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my aim. The figure stopped, tilting his head slightly, as if amused. You think you can stop me? You think a simple weapon can stop what I am? I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the fear that gnawed at my insides. My instincts told me I needed to get out, but something in my heart refused to abandon Max. I wasn't going to leave my partner behind. No matter the cost. I won't let you hurt anyone else, I said, my voice stronger now, though my hands betrayed me. The figure's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth to it. It was a smile filled with darkness, filled with the knowledge that he had the upper hand. You misunderstand, officer. The mistake has already been made. There's nothing you can do to fix it. There's nothing you can do to stop me now. I raised the gun, my eyes locked on him. He didn't move, didn't flinch. It was as if he didn't even see me as a threat. But I couldn't back down. I wouldn't. Then, just as I was about to make a choice, the room suddenly grew colder. Colder than it had ever been before. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the shadows seemed to come alive, stretching and warping in the corners of my vision. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the doorway, but it was only for a moment, just a flash. But in that instant, I felt a sense of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, there was someone, or something on my side. I didn't know if it was my desperation or my instincts kicking in, but I moved before I had time to think. I rushed toward Max, scooping him up into my arms. The figure didn't react. Instead, he just watched, his dark eyes flickering with amusement, as though he knew exactly what I was doing. Leave now, he said, his voice low. You can still walk out of here, but the moment you try to fight, you'll be just like him. I glanced at Carl's body in the casket, the lifeless eyes staring back at me. The truth was clear now. He wasn't just dead. He was a puppet, a vessel for something far worse. But I couldn't just leave. I couldn't walk away and pretend like everything was fine. With one last glance at the figure, I made my choice. I wasn't gonna run. Not anymore. I turned toward the door, and with all the strength I had left, I ran. I don't know how I made it out of that funeral home. I don't know how I managed to carry Max to safety, but somehow I did. I never went back. I couldn't. There was no explanation for what had happened that day, and I knew if I tried to tell anyone, no one would believe me. But I carry the memory with me, the knowledge of what I saw, of what I almost became. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear Carl's whisper, the warning that came too late. "They'll come for you," he had said. And somewhere deep down, I know that wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this story touched you and brought some inspiration your way. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, and share with others who might love it too. And if you want to see more stories just like this, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me and helps me create even more content for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below. Until next time, stay amazing.